Those who know do, those who understand teach. And when I was teaching, this really hit home because I had to know enough about what I was teaching to be able to advise students who'd never seen the content before. But most of the time, I just felt like this guy, right? Standing up, kind of making it up as I went along. There is enough time and distance between my students graduating, becoming successful, and their educational journeys wrapping up. I can admit most of the time I was 1 or 2 lessons ahead of them. That's about all it was. And that's not because I didn't know the material. It was because there's so much material to cover in security that you can't possibly hope to learn it all. So you have to be able to go back and be okay with learning again, starting from the fundamentals again, building up that foundation again, enough to get to a point where somebody else who's never seen it feels comfortable asking you the questions that they need. More importantly, you yourself have to be comfortable in saying, I don't actually know the answer. I'll go get it for you, and being okay with that. Next slide, please. Okay, so there's a bunch of stuff that comes from this. So in winter 2020, so I needed a plan to keep up attendance, both for my sake and for my students, because I wanted to go start my weekend early, even though I was teaching, and weekends are a little bit different when you're an adjunct instructor. But keeping students in seats at this time slot was really tough. Next. So the PCI standard requires annual tabletop testing. I'm sure if you haven't seen that, you'll likely encounter it. A lot of organizations in my experience overlooked this. It was, yeah, oh yeah, we'll test the incident response plan later. Oh yeah, or we had an incident, we tested it then. But there wasn't really a lot of, structure around it so much. And because I had the time and I didn't have any auditors asking for any of this, let's have a tabletop, right? Famous last words. When I'm trying to keep students in the seat, why would I give them something that's likely to repel them, right? So it had to be fun, interesting, and engaging. I wanted to do something else a little bit differently. I needed it to scale to 30 plus students because I think I had about 35 at the time. And the incident response process was largely a mystery at this point in the process. It's a tough nut to crack. Next. So again, there's enough time and distance between that session, I can admit. A good portion of it was heavily improvised. So I walked into that classroom with 6 very specific outcomes that I wanted to achieve. And I just basically used a handful of dice that was provided by one of the students who had plenty of these D20s laying around, right? And everybody knows one of those. And it was just, the ravings of a lunatic in front of a whiteboard, teaching incident response, making some of it up as we went along. But what really happened was quite interesting. Next slide for me, please. What I found was all of my students came to that session, every single one, at a tough time slot in a windowless basement, and they all showed up. They learned a lot of the concepts very quickly. In fact, some of the students who previously didn't show a lot of aptitude and interest in a lot of the material were asking me questions I would expect from the executive suite post-incident. What did this cost? How do we prevent this next time? How did this happen? All of this really interesting information that basically I hadn't expected to hear afterwards. But we got a look at how the incident response process plays out in a very specific and pragmatic fashion. From start to finish was 2 hours, so it didn't really take very long. And I actually found that a lot of my students took those concepts with them into their businesses, because I'm hearing from those students who played the games that went, I remember that, and I brought it into the workplace. All right, it's time to do something cool with this. Next slide for me. So I once worked with this sales manager. I guess we'll call him, he was a manager who also sold. So it was a little bit of a mixed hat. Next semester I had, so the original plan was actually to present the incoherent ramblings of a lunatic at B-Sides 2020, but there's a very significant pandemic going around. Everything was locked down. So I had nothing but time to sit and do something else. But I was still teaching. But all of teaching went remote. And I had a lot of other issues that really I hadn't evaluated before. Most notably, I was teaching PCI. That wasn't really a problem. But a traditional midterm wasn't an option because I had mature students who were now time sharing their technology with their children who were going to school at the same time. So to expect them to log on, regurgitate a bunch of answers onto 2 pieces of paper in hopes that they learned something Just wasn't feasible. And it's not the way I wanted to spend my time. So I needed something that actually worked, got to the heart of what we were going to do, the core components of parts of the class, and would give them something that they could take with them that was lasting and meaningful. Next slide, please. So I said we were going to have an incident. We were going to have the students had this incident. So we went through the first one, and that was the first kind of virtual representation of it. It was a handful of Excel sheets, a handful of reference sheets. We were all kind of fumbling with what to do, including myself to some degree. But a lot of what I had done as far as the catastrophic failures were largely improvised in the moment. So I actually had to write some of them down because I wanted to remember them. They were quite interesting. But the abilities I found were actually better served as information about the skills that you need for incident response. And they also kind of made a little bit of light of some of the stories of my career. So it was a way to kind of inspire conversation and get some of that interesting creative energy flowing in the room at the same time. Next slide. So the reason why this was significant was instead of a traditional midterm, the students got an incident and they had to take home the report. And the reality of it was this was assigned on a Thursday and I needed it by Monday, 9 a.m. because my auditors in London were going to lay an egg otherwise. So it was, as real as business gets, right? There was an incident, we didn't predict it, and now we have to write the report and get it done. But what happened was they turned in excellent work. Some of those reports were actually really high quality. I would use them to embarrass professionals in the industry doing this for longer than I have. Really, really quality work came from a very short period of time because the foundation for it to grow was provided in a way that worked with the students, their lives, and the chaos that was around at the time. Because I was flexible on what I needed to see, but very specific on the deadlines, gave them the tips and made it real. As in, you can share your notes, but you all have to hand in your own report. There was no competition. There was nothing but collaboration between everybody. And that was significant. Next slide. I didn't look this quote up. I looked up the Aristotle one. I didn't look this up. I'm guessing Abraham Lincoln said it. So one thing I learned about the whole process was I wanted to be more of a presenter in this concept and less of a game sheet management, right? Because when I'm switching between Excel sheets, trying to figure out where this went and everything else, that doesn't work, it doesn't scale, and there's better ways to do it because part of this work was the presentation aspect of it, right? So if you're busy flipping through sheets, you lose a lot of that momentum. So it was time to start building something that could do this work for me. So I hadn't touched programming IDE since circa 2013. There were a lot of them out there when I went looking. So it was a bit of a, okay, which one do I want to work with? I had spent some time with Java, a little bit of time with C#, but all of that had evolved long past what I was doing. So I remembered the programming concepts that I took from school, but I had to reapply them in a way that I understood. I knew some Python from having eked out a few scripts here and there to solve some problems, but more or less it was kind of a mess. But the upside to it is, my wife is a physician and was during the pandemic. So when I wasn't teaching, all I had time to do was drink and worry. So I might as well write some code while I'm at it, right? Which was, kind of like, it was good. It was a good way to like take your mind off of things a bit. But there's a point in time in every aspect of every business, including what I was doing here, where I couldn't just strategize around the problem. There's always a point where you have to just push through, you have to do the work, you have to do the manual labor. I equate it to a basement that we've all been meaning to clean out because I have a basement I've been meaning to clean out. You can reorganize, you can put up shelves, you can do all of it, but at some point you just have to show up and push through it. And that's what happened here. So from the start to finish, including all the learning, all the mistakes, all the mess, all the hassle, it was about 400 hours. Next. So a little about the original version of it. It was entirely web-based because I was able to push some buttons and host it on a potato chip. So that was genuinely appealing, especially for a remote setting. Object-oriented-ish, but yeah, I'm not much of a coder. So there were plenty of spaghetti incidents and poorly optimized, poorly designed, but it worked. And the idea was automated handling for nearly everything because all I wanted to do was show up with a tool that was ready and just focus on presenting, teaching, learning the human side of what this was about. Let the computers do the computer work. I wanted to do the human work, and that's what I built here. Next slide. So There was a bit of automation that went into it because I'm what I call the productive kind of lazy. If I can get a robot to do my work for me, I'm all about that. The problem is you have to build it, right? You have to build that time, and that takes a lot of effort, but it is worth it. It continues to pay dividends, and I love automation. I would automate everything I possibly could if I possibly could. But the way that I wanted to build this was I needed asset inventories. I needed abilities. I needed all of these things to be presentable in game. And I wanted them to show up, and I wanted them to be flexible in a way that I could build and scale this. So there was a lot of automation that went into actually creating the systems that built the first game in general. So when I walked in with a tool that was ready to go, that all started because of a lot of the scripting and automation that went into creating the files it needed in order to run properly. But it worked. It worked really well. And I wanted to keep track of a few things because I had a feeling that some clients would be, we have some custom processes and we need to see when this happens. So I had built some of that in anticipation of that showing up. Next slide. Next, yeah, there we go. So at B-Sides 2020, when we went virtual, this was ready. It was a little bit rough around the edges, but it worked. And the first session was really well. People came in, they played, they had a good time, they learned stuff. I met tons of new people in the process of doing that. And it was an excellent way to contribute to an excellent conference that has done so much good for the ecosystem in the city. The really nice thing about it was designed virtually. So now remote teams, remote conferences, this was all ready to go. The in-person version actually would have been worse than what I had built. So in essence, seizing an opportunity at a time when it can be really difficult to do that actually accelerated everything considerably. Next slide. So yeah, where it started, the incoherent ramblings of a lunatic. Where it went, this is the first version of it. Again, you can tell it's a little rough, right? There's, buttons, they all pushed, they all did something, but it certainly wasn't as nice as I wanted it to be. And the new iteration of it, way more robust, way more features, way more functionality. I can get really groovy with a lot of your incident response plan with the new version of my game. While the current version, it's not even new anymore, it's current. It's rolled into production, right? So that journey was quite significant. Next slide. Yeah, so what? So this is the one I was looking for. I had an English teacher once upon a time ago, and this was his catchphrase. And so for the first half of the class, he would stand up and pontificate about how big food is killing all of us, the big food lobbies. And as I got older, I realized, hey, we actually did poison our food supply. That sucks. But so what? He would always ask you that question. And it was never meant to be derogatory, which was kind of weird because he would ask it in class and we'd always feel like, why aren't you paying attention? This was designed to change our programming in a manner of speaking, because in school, especially in English literature classes, you're taught to regurgitate an opinion about a book. And he didn't want any of that. He wanted to hear what we thought about it. What did it resonate with us? What happened? Why was it relevant? Did you like it? Did you not like it? So why is this here, right? Because I think the storytelling parts of security are amazing. I think by showcasing that these journeys are possible, even in times of great chaos and bizarre situations, it's important to understand that not all stories leave you with something you can take with you. That just doesn't work for me. I want you to take something from this. So while we're all sitting here, just in the back of your heads for now, this is a thought experiment. I want you to think about what your ideal day at work looks like. Because I woke up some time ago and realized my generation was never going to retire, and I was going to have to work until I was dead. And I'm okay with the reality of that. That's okay. Because there is also some research coming out that says you reach a certain age, you stop working, you stop having a reason to do some stuff. It gets a little hard on the mind. So while we're all here, just in the back of your heads, think about what your day at work would look like. Don't imagine the job exists. Ignore that for a second. If you could pick your day at work from a series of things you want to spend your time on, what would that day look like? Just think about it. Just think about it. Keep it in the back of your head as we carry on. So the reason this is all significant, no, so go back. Go back. Go back. We're going to stay here for a bit. So the reason this is significant is because this was what happened. I sat down one day and I went, what do I want my day at work to look like? I wanted to spend some time automating the tedious stuff I didn't like. I wanted to have fun. I wanted to do interesting things, meet interesting people, and actually solve the security problems that I'd been staring at for the last 10 years. I wanted to do something different. And because I sat down and leaned into that, Fortunately, I was teaching at the time, and some of that work was coming into orbit organically. I was spending time having fun. I could automate some of that work if I really wanted to. I'd heard tale of instructors that had scripted their marking. I didn't go that far because I felt that would be a significant disservice. I really liked reading what my students had and giving them that effective feedback, but that was an option. I wanted to meet interesting people. A lot of the people that I met while I was teaching, very interesting students I'm still in touch with today. They're milling around this conference, seeing them successful, interesting people, right? All of that was amazing because I sat down and I thought about what I wanted my day at work to look like. But I never stopped thinking about that. And in late 2020, I realized that teaching was great, but it certainly didn't pay the bills, and I had bills to pay. And I wound up using the game that I had built and the discoveries that came from it as talking points to work my way into an executive position at one of the world's largest banks. They needed somebody in the incident response team. I applied thinking, okay, maybe I'll get in, maybe I won't, it doesn't matter. And the half-hour conversation, 15 minutes of which were about this game that I built and what I taught my students with it, got me through all the rounds. To a point where they were giving me decisions, which, I mean, sure, I don't know that I'd want to belong to a club that would have me as a member, but that's a whole other consideration. But I now had an opportunity to work with some of the smartest security people I'd ever met, and in an organization that was willing to invest heavily in the process, where I had freedom and flexibility to learn, grow, and develop, automate more of my work, meet interesting people, learn interesting things, and expand my ideas and my growth. Because I sat down and I figured out what I wanted that day to look like, and I just kept working towards a job that would get me there. And then one day in that bank, I was given a decision. I can either become a manager for less money, more hours, and very little thanks. That was an option. The other option was change teams, learn some new skills, whatever else I had going on. But I picked the third option, do this instead. Because what I was building, I had been building this the whole time that I was working there. A little bit every day, whatever I could muster, keeping in mind that I was still a person. I needed to do things like sleep and have fun and enjoy myself. So a little every day, got a lot done in a very short period of time. And by the time I was faced with that decision, I actually had a better plan. I was going to do this instead because I was having fun, automating the tedious parts of my work, meeting interesting people, solving the problems the way that I wanted, the way that I wanted to bring to the industry in a manner that mattered, that I felt was really interesting and really compelling. And I think too often we're told that the way that we have to grow our careers, the way that we have to grow our lives in general, is specific. You get out of school, you have to go get this job first. You have to go do this first. You have to go do that. And I ran across students with this all the time. I think I want to be a SOC analyst. Why? Well, because it's the next natural progression. Yeah, okay, but is it? Let me show you a day in that life. And some of them would go, that sounds awesome, actually, sign me up. Great. There's all kinds of SOC meals out there for you. But no, that's actually not how I want to spend my time. So let's take a step back. Let's evaluate how you want to spend your time because it's all you get, right? Money is money. It comes and goes. It's great. I'd love more of it. Nobody ever said, no, that's too much money. Please take it away, right? But time is really all we get. It's all we get to spend our time on. So how do you want to spend that time? And so that's why I asked you at the beginning here. Think about your day at work. Think about it as though that job already exists because this job didn't exist. All of the things I wanted to do, all of the targets I wanted to hit didn't exist. So I went out and invented it and did so in a way that was purposeful, in a way that I wanted to do it, in a way that was unconventional. And I've decided to grow the business unconventionally because it means that I have an opportunity to do something a little unconventional. And it might seem a little bit weird, but at some point I realized one day I'll be dead and none of it will have mattered. And that might sound really defeatist, right? But it actually gave me permission not to worry about what would happen. And that might, again, seem really like, cool, good for you, right? Like the reality of it is you have to build some things, you have to do some stuff that matters to you. Otherwise, what are you spending your time on? Why does any of that matter? So when you get weird and wonderful with your careers and weird and wonderful with your hobbies and the things that go outside of it, you draw a lot of very interesting conclusions. Once upon a time ago, I'll finish this article series one day, but I was getting a little bit groovy with the SharePoint Office 365 cloud. And I realized, hey, this could take off some of the hassles of gardening for me. And I uploaded and managed some of my gardening from the O365 Power Suite. And then I drew conclusions between growing seeds in my yards to information security management. And I presented that to my bosses at the bank, and that made the rounds among senior management, at which point they read it and came back to my boss and said, are we about to lose AJ? Because they read it and they said, this reads like he's angling for some senior management stuff somewhere else. And my boss said, no, he's got about 2 or 3 months before he goes. It was about 2 or 3 months, and then I went to do this instead. And all I had in mind was the typical problems I needed to solve with gardening were remembering to plant my seeds, which seems like that's like the foundation, right? How could you forget that? Life gets busy. But building that up into some automation and some interesting outcomes with the environment that I was working in created all kinds of new opportunities to see how, yeah, it was just gardening, but the problem solved with the human factor translates between industries, between disciplines. And getting people engaged in a behavior change in an organization, that's what we're all trying to do in security in general. So whether it was me trying to figure out when it was a good time to plant my seeds or trying to convince people that a security program mattered, considering the human factor in everything that I built was everything that I had brought to the table. And by presenting it and talking about it and getting nerdy about the problem and getting creative with the solutions now offered me an enormous amount of, dare I say, portfolio pieces. So in the event that this whole business idea doesn't work, I now have a lot to show for the time that I spent and I had learned. And we evaluate a business as successful because it's still here. So we all look at Blockbuster as being an abysmal failure, except it was the rental movie juggernaut at the time when movie rentals were all the rage. They were wildly successful. Times changed, they didn't, they moved on. Not every business has to be here for 1,000 years, right? But the reality of the situation is I wanted something that I just enjoyed spending my time on. And when you enjoy spending your time on something, you gravitate towards the people that enjoy spending that time with you. You start to find a lot of the people that want you around, case in point, to talk about these things. And it's those conversations that show people a little more of what you're about. Better than any resume, better than any cover letter, better than anything else you can present that's conventional. Because if you walked into a job interview with, I built a game and it taught this and I did this and it accomplished the following, any senior security manager is going to go, that's a demonstrated aptitude of understanding the problem and an attempt to solve it. Whereas the resume was responsible for this, managed that. I want the one who can demonstrate the knowledge that they built. So whatever you're doing, learning needs to be at the core of it. And whatever you learned, applying that knowledge in a way that you care about is the catalyst that you need to start these interesting conversations to get you into places that maybe you wouldn't have thought you would ever be. The people I was working with at the bank, if they were giving talks, I would have happily called in sick, whatever I needed to do to go and sit and have a conversation with them. Every week they were booking calls with me, asking for information about how I can help their security program. It was wild. It was just so wild, right? And it was a very collaborative solution. And I loved working there. I loved being around those people and swimming in a bigger pond and looking for something that actually meant more to me than trying to do it the conventional way. So with all of that in your head, if you're looking for permission to get a little weird and wonderful with whatever it is that you're looking to do, this is it. This is the conference. This is the place. Did you know you can go crash a train over there? I've never seen a conference where you can crash a train. It's over there. I know the guy that built it. You can tell because his hair's all crazy. And when us Leece fellows have, hair that looks a little bit weird, we're always working on something. Yeah, and this is the place. If it wasn't for B-Sides allowing information just like this to come in to an open community setting, interesting topics, all kinds of things, I would not have the game that I have today. It wouldn't have been anywhere close. But because I was willing to take a chance and they were willing to take a chance and the community was willing to be a part of it, all of that gravitated towards something incredible. And I think in our case, we're too worried about this. We're too worried about what if it doesn't work? Well, then so what? At least you learned something. And as long as you're learning, as long as you're growing, as long as you're developing, that's what matters the most. Next slide, please. All right, so all we have to do is keep talking, right? I love conversations, they're good. Stories are great. Here's how to find me. Here's how to get in touch. Whatever you got going on, I'd love to hear it. Just let me know. It's all good. Maybe I'll stand out of the frame. I think there's probably a rule against taking photos with me in them. Just Photoshop a Sasquatch over it or something. Next slide. All right. Any questions? Yeah. 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 You heard of dual core? Have you ever heard of dual core? Oh, go look up dual core. Not right now. You can do it whenever, but doesn't have to be right this second. Yeah. Dual core was the main staple at every DerbyCon that I went to. Yeah. Playing music at security conferences, all about getting nerdy with music. The guy that built the train that crashes kept me in diapers with his music. So you can go talk to him about that too. It'll be all good. I promise. Whatever medium you choose, as long as you spend the time the way you want to and you learn something from it and you align it to the problems that need to be solved or that you want to solve, the ones that you're crazy about, you're limited by your imagination and maybe a bit of luck. Yeah. Yep. Yeah, you have to showcase what it can offer. And I found that the big struggle was if it looks too much like a game, you lose the plot. So I've had to tone down some of the games that I built because they were just a little too stimulating. But if you can align what you're teaching to the outcomes, whether it be within the security program or with whatever you're trying to change behavior-wise in the awareness program, if you can demonstrate that, even in a demo situation, that can have a lasting effect. The other piece of it is get a small group together. If it's you have a captive audience of those people somewhere, somebody in that group would be willing to do that. Just start asking the questions. Hey, what if we had a game instead of a PowerPoint slide? Some people that are interested, you could set it up. You do a bit of a lunch and learn, right? Like everybody likes free sandwiches, right? You just sort of create an incentive for people to come and you solve that captive audience problem. And then you kind of dazzle them with the engagement, the effort that comes on the other side of it. And if that doesn't work, then you can come find me and I'll help out with some of that. Yeah. Yeah. Yes. Yeah, I think what we're seeing now with gamification and everything in the security space. I'm not the only one playing games to handle security problems. I'm definitely not doing it in the OT space. But I think it's an excellent primer. It's an excellent way to get people interested and present the material in a way that blends the creative and the logic together. Because one of the struggles with learning is if you're learning in the abstract, I can teach you about how a command line works. I can show you why this matters in the context. But if you aren't learning it in a cohesive way that gets you creative and expanding on that learning, all you're going to do is be really good at using it in this specific form. So I think those of us in the gamification space, we have to be careful because if we simplify it too much, then we actually lose a lot of the valuable knowledge that would come from having to do it the traditional way. So I don't see it as a replacement. I see it as an incentive to go, okay, I understand how these concepts work in a broad stroke. That's really interesting to me. I'm going to dig into that. And then that's where you start to get a little groovy with the technology and whatever it is you're trying to solve. So if you're new to this business and you're trying to learn some of these fundamentals, I would say it's an excellent way to figure out some of the basics, but it's going to get you part of the way there. What you do with what you've learned and how you expand on that learning into the technical space and whatever it is that you find interesting, that's the stuff that's going to help you solve the problems within the business. Because as much as security is serious, it is also lighthearted. So you do have to blend some of that together. But yeah, I would say use it as a catalyst to get you interested in the parts that you are curious about. Yeah. Mhm. Good. You know, I I would say it's not about how much you enjoy it. I'd say use it as an opportunity to present it, right? So it's not don't wait for it to come up in the conversation, because you will undoubtedly get a question of, tell me about something innovative you did. What's something that you learned? Tell me about a problem you solved in a business. And coming fresh out of school, you might be a little light on that background, but that capstone, that's practical knowledge applied in a real setting, albeit in a lab environment, but it still solves a problem. So the conversation you have is, my capstone accomplished the following, and here's how I feel like it solves the problem. And I really enjoyed the work that I'm doing, and outside of school, I've since expanded on it with these new additions, this new functionality. I got tired of solving this problem, so I wrote a script that made it for me. That kind of stuff is still applied knowledge in a way that matters to the business. Doesn't have to be games, right? Games are my jam, but if that's not for you, that's cool. But if you're, don't we all? But if you enjoy your capstone for what it is, and you see the problem that it can solve in a business, lean into that problem. If you find it really interesting, there are businesses probably just right out there who would also find your solution very interesting. So just be really unapologetic about talking about it in interviews. I saw a couple questions. Yeah. Mhm. Yeah. Yeah, actually, the game that's in my arcade cabinet at the booth, SecOps Chaos, is very heavily into the game side of it, less in the security side, but it's a light touch with the security piece. As you navigate through, it's a familiar mechanic. Most of the students that you would play with at that age are familiar at least with Super Mario or some variation thereof. Those mechanics are identical. You're hopping along, but you're dodging emails. There's security lessons involved, but it's fun, interesting, and engaging. But it's tough to get that in a boardroom because it's too far on the game side of it. But it has a little bit more mass appeal. Absolutely. So more of those games are coming. Yeah. The idea being, I want a wider, more end user focus, more student based focus, you know, K to 12, that next step in education as well. Because we have attackers that aren't finished primary school yet. So let's start showing them the value of doing this properly. Yeah. And let's do it. Let's meet them where they're at. Yeah. Yeah. Uh, I was in I originally went for a diploma in business administration and realized that I should probably do something else because I didn't really have much of a plan other than B is for business. And so, okay, it was time to do something else. And they had introduced at Mount Royal a degree that was half business, half IT, the Bachelor of Computer Information Systems. So you got a sample of some of the technology, mostly just heavy programming courses for what that was worth. And the business side of it was, you know, a little bit siloed. But the idea was, you know, if you were applying the learning correctly, the stuff you were learning in one class, you could apply to another. So it was half business, half IT at its core. But I've always been really enamored with business. Apparently, I have had this ideas, you know, all these ideas since I was a kid. So I guess it's one of those things that just sort of came naturally. But yeah, half business, half IT, because it gave me the ability to speak to the business problems with a technology solution. Yeah. I would argue that you can read a textbook all day long, but until you actually show up and get your hands dirty with some of it, you're not actually really learning. You're just memorizing. There you go. So you just hit on it right there. So the way that I got into IT in general, when I was in school, I knew a guy that needed a guy. So he was working at a managed services provider, and his boss came to him and said, I'd like you to find somebody who can do an incredibly thankless, tedious job for very little money. And I was that guy. But the reality of it, we were sitting in the interview room, and I was having a conversation with my soon-to-be boss. And he said, I really like what you're about. I'm not even going to interview the rest. And he created a bit of a political firestorm, but that was his headache. But while I was working in that space, I was cleaning up a monitoring tool that had been purchased and just kind of abandoned. And so in the process of cleaning it up and getting it to work to the point where we could migrate over to it, I had actually learned so much about infrastructure, so much about corporate IT, about managing systems, computer customer service to some degree, because you get tickets coming in and it's like, hey, this is broken, please fix it. And so getting the requirements and understanding what needed to be done, working with, you know, emergent outage situations in corporate settings, I learned more in 4 months on that job than I did in the past 2 years at school. I know that's probably hard to hear for some of the educators in the room, but the reality of the situation is you can learn in a classroom all day long, but until you actually get groovy with the work itself, the learning doesn't quite cement. So if you learn best by doing, then get busy. Well, that's fair. That's fair. Any other questions? Oh, we're out of time. Okay, well, we can do this. I'm going back to my booth at the Marcade. If you have any more questions, you want to come hang out, please feel free to do so. Thank you for your time and attention. Have a great con.